Welcome to the History of Nerds podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Today, Jeffrey Kluger in his book, Gemini. Yeah, we'll talk about the pronunciation in a second. Promise, we'll get there. It's space, man. It's a good time. We're going to talk about it. One of Jeffrey's previous books became Apollo 13, the movie that, everybody saw. So, this dude already knows what he's doing with this subject. Great conversation with him. I had so much fun. So how about I shut up? Let's bring on Jeffrey. And here we are with author Jeffrey Kluger. Gemini, yes, I know I'm saying it wrong. That's not the subtitle. The subtitle is Stepping Stone to the Moon, The Untold Story. Jeffrey, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
I always like to start off, Jeffrey, by just establishing some bona fides of the guest. Have you ever written about space before, or have you ever written something that maybe became a gigantic Hollywood movie, for instance?
Well, yes, my first experience writing a book was called Lost Moon when I wrote it. It was ultimately changed to Apollo 13, and it became it was the book that became the movie that created something of a sensation. Here we are 30 years later, and Apollo 13 is now being re-released in IMAX. So the movie has a very long tail, and it sort of set me off on writing a number of other space books. I wrote one called Moon Hunters, about the unmanned, uncrewed exploration of the solar system. I wrote a book on Apollo 8. I've written a couple of young adult books on space, and now I have Gemini.
I have to say, that's got to spoil you. You're kind of first shot, and it's like, oh, Ron Howard wants to turn this into a movie. You got to be thinking, I'm pinching myself every day.
Right, exactly. I remember thinking, all of my books are going to be movies now. And here we are again, 30 years later. I'm still waiting for movie number 2. It'll come. I'm convinced.
Setting me straight, I'm going to keep saying Gemini. I refuse to say it. But as far as NASA is concerned, I'm saying it wrong, aren't I?
Indeed. Within NASA, it was Gemini, spelled the exact same way, but it was Gemini 12, Gemini 8, the Gemini program. And that all started because the folks of NASA were not astrology buffs. So when the word Gemini first was raised, a lot of them didn't know how to pronounce it. So it became sort of an in-house shibboleth, a rite of passage, a signal of your belonging to a particular social group to mispronounce it. So everything within NASA was pronounced Gemini. And finally, in order to appease the press, they had to issue an official statement saying that the agency's formal naming committee, I don't think any such committee existed, but they attributed it to the formal naming committee, and they said that for purposes of NASA, it would be pronounced Gemini. That was the correct pronunciation.
I'm still sticking to mine.
Yeah.
Sometimes NASA is wrong. It's all that I'm saying.
It happens to every agency. I'm sure they are sometimes.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't realize this because they think Apollo 13 and we think of that name, and you kind of, you assign it almost really to a spaceship rather than what it is, which is a mission.
Right.
And so Gemini, what was this program and why is it? And I appreciate this. You say the Untold Story. Very often there are books with those subtitles where it's like, no, we know that story.
Right.
This one really is overlooked. How and why?
Well, it's funny. One of my books came out, I think, in 2011, was called The Sibling Effect. And it was about, as the name suggests, about the power of siblings. And I wrote a lot in there about the overlooked middle sibling. And I think that definition really applies to the Gemini program because, you had the Mercury program when we first sent astronauts into space. It was the very first American in space when Alan Shepard went up. It was the first American to orbit the Earth when John Glenn went up. We had never been in space before, so Mercury made all kinds of headlines, and Tom Wolfe wrote the definitive book on it and made the definitive movie, The Right Stuff. No one in the 40 years since The Right Stuff came out, people haven't written about Mercury because he planted that flag firmly. Similarly, the Apollo program, I wrote about it. Andy Chaikin, who wrote a book called A Man on the Moon, terrific piece of writing, he wrote about it. A number of the astronauts wrote about it. And this was when humans landed on the moon. So it was a global sensation, those missions. The Gemini program was much more of a blue-collar, workman-like lunch bucket program. It was 2 men at a time, and they were all men at that point, going up into space. They weren't going to the moon. They weren't the first people to go up in space, but they learned all of the skills that were necessary to get us to the moon. We didn't know if astronauts could survive more than, 3 or 4 days at maximum in a spacecraft. So in Gemini 5, Pete Conrad and Gordon Cooper went up for 8 days. And in Gemini 7, Jim Lovell and Frank Borman went up for 14 days. So they established that men could survive and continue to work for long duration missions that were the equivalent of the length of time that it would take to go to the moon. Similarly, we learned how to spacewalk. Ed White became the first American to spacewalk, and many of the other astronauts performed EVAs, extravehicular activity, after him. We similarly learned how to rendezvous with another spacecraft, how to dock with another spacecraft. All of these were skills that would be needed to get to the moon. Without Gemini, there would have been no Apollo. And that is a point we make again and again and again in the book. And, every time a spacecraft docks with the International Space Station, they are building on skills that Neil Armstrong and Dave Scott first developed when they docked with their Regina spacecraft. Every time people walk in space, they're building on skills that we learned in Gemini. So this program has stayed with us, even though its workmanlike quality caused it to make fewer headlines than the other programs did. But again, without Gemini, there would have been no moon landings.
So I guess based upon what you're saying, Jeffrey, is I'm going to dedicate this episode to the middle brother in my family. Kevin, there's your shout out on the podcast. It won't happen again. I hate to go to a weird place early on, Jeffrey, but when you're talking about this time in history, there's no way around it. I'm a little uncomfortable where we got a lot of our rocket knowledge from post-World War II. Now, there's Nazis, right, and we let Nazis give us a lot of intelligence. Now, I think a lot of people will try and say, oh, that's horrible. Were these kind of real Nazis like high up there, or these scientists who were kind of forced to join the party? How do we kind of unspool that in a way that we don't feel like, we're getting in a bad place?
I think it's impossible to unspool it. I remember reading a book when I was in elementary school on Wernher von Braun, and this was written for elementary school kids. Von Braun was, a huge figure at that point. And I remember they said in that book, they sanitized it for school children. So they said, had he not joined the party and joined the missile program, bad things would have happened to his family. So he did it to protect his family. I have no idea if there's any truth in that. I think the fact that Wernher von Braun and his team built the V2s and the buzz bombs that terrorized London and killed, I think, 1,200 people in London over the course of, about a year of bombardment, they can be redeemed in ways that, say, Robert Oppenheimer couldn't be. The Germans had their von Braun, we had our Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer built the bomb, but did not go on to do other things. Von Braun terrorized London, but in the second half of his life, he did do good things for the U.S. and for the world. Nothing scrubs the stain of working with the Nazis completely away. But there is some redemption in what these people did in the second half of their lives. It was him, it was Gunter Wendt, it was just, his team of Germans from Peenemünde were captured and, put to work trying to scrub their reputations a bit by working for the West in a peaceable program.
And from the U.S. government's perspective at this point, they needed all the help they could get, because at this point, it looks like the Russians are really kind of pulling ahead, which it's always, of course, at this point in time, hard to really know exactly what was going on in Russia. We don't hear everything. But the U.S. government, especially, I didn't realize how integral Lyndon Johnson was in kind of shooting this all off. Can you talk a little bit about his role in this?
Sure. Yeah. Johnson, I mean, Kennedy gets credit for planting that flag and saying we're going to be at the moon, on the moon before the end of the decade. He did it at Rice University in 1962, and he did it in a speech before Congress in 1971. He committed the U.S. to going to the moon on May 25th, 61, and we had exactly 15 minutes of space experience at that point. Alan Shepard had gone up for a 15-minute pop gun suborbital, and Kennedy was saying we're going to be on the moon in 9 years. So Kennedy gets the credit, but actually the real engine behind that administration was LBJ, was Johnson as vice president. When NASA was established in 1958, he was the man in Congress who whipped that bill creating NASA through Congress and onto President Eisenhower's desk. And in that bill, the president was given enormous power, to dictate what would happen in the space program. When JFK was elected and Johnson was his vice president, Johnson had about 3 months from November to January 3rd, 3 months left in Congress in his powerful role as majority leader to give himself even more power over the space program. So as I write in Gemini, I think it was 27 different places in the law that established NASA. The president was vested with power to make the determination of budgeting, to make the determination of when launches would go off, to make the determination about where NASA's various facilities, its various headquarters would be built. Johnson went through every one of those places, and where it said the president shall, he added or vice president. So it was the president or vice president will decide upon launches. The president or vice president will allocate the NASA budget. When he got to the White House, the program was thus very much in his control. And JFK, who was busy with so many other things, not the least being things like the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis, was only too happy to outsource it to his enthusiastic vice president. There is a reason that the Manned Spacecraft Center was built in Houston, Johnson's home state, as opposed to the 20-some other localities, the 20-some other cities that were competing for it. So Johnson really was the administration's beating heart when it came to the space program. And every presidency since then, the vice president has had NASA in his or her portfolio. And that is something that was established in 1961 and is still the case here in 2025.
What you do such an exceptional job in this book of is showing we know how it ends. So you kind of forget this. That timeline was pure insanity.
Right.
When they announced it, because you show there's all these specific steps that, first of all, don't seem huge, but we'll talk about how complicated all of these things could be. But also a bad weather day,
right?
A screw comes loose somewhere. Everything they did, millions of parts, one of them goes wrong and you might lose a month or two.
Right.
And this is, we're going from not zero, but close to it, to we're going to be on the moon.
Right.
It was just an absolutely insane timeline to even put that out there, right?
It was really nuts. I mean, when you think about all of the, as you say, all the hurdles that had to be overcome in order to get where they got, and the small breakdowns that could prevent a launch going up at any point for any reason. The Gemini 6 mission was scrubbed on the pad. The engines lit and then were shut down. The mission was postponed for several days, and engineers combed through the innards of the booster looking for what was wrong. And they found a tiny dust cover about the size of a nickel that was placed over a particular valve, over a single valve deep in the rocket's engine that prevented that mission from going up. So the scale of the breakdowns could be infinitesimal, but they had very big impact in preventing a rocket from getting off the ground in the first place. And yes, when you talk about the speed with which they launched these missions, from March of 1965 to November of 1966, which was 20 months, they launched 10 missions. So they had men going up every 60 days in a program that hadn't even existed 5 years before.
One of my favorite, very specific acronyms that comes out of your book, and I love it because you have these amazingly intelligent scientists doing these amazing things with these amazing machines. Can you tell me about SNORT, though?
SNORT, I actually wrote it down here so I wouldn't forget the acronym. It stands for Supersonic Naval Ordnance Research Track. And what this was basically a test bed, a speed track that was, I think, 4.2 miles long. No, 2.4 miles long in the desert of California, and a sled would be placed on it that would be rocketed to velocities, accelerated to speeds over 2,000 miles an hour, because that is the speed a Titan booster, which carried the Gemini spacecraft into orbit, that's the speed it would be attaining. And the point of the SNORT was to test the ejection seats at the speed at which a spacecraft, a rocket and a spacecraft would be moving. So this sled would tear along the desert floor at 2,000 miles an hour, and they would hit a button and eject a dummy astronaut in order to see if the ejection seats that were built into the Gemini spacecraft would work and be able to function at the velocity at which a rocket would be moving. More times than not, it failed. More times than not, it wound up with mannequin-shaped holes in the desert floor where the astronaut crashed. The earlier boosters, the Mercury boosters, had an escape tower that would pull the spacecraft away from the rocket if the rocket was threatening to explode. The astronauts wanted an escape tower in the Gemini program, but doing away with the escape tower saved about 1,500 pounds, which could then go to other scientific equipment or other more essential components in the spacecraft. So the astronauts instead were stuck with using ejection seats. All of them were familiar with ejection seats from military planes, but this seat would be ejecting them much faster than any other ejection seat they'd ever flown before. It would accelerate them to 20 Gs, which is, if you weigh 200 pounds, that's, I think, 4,000 pounds. You would feel like you weighed. So 20 Gs all by itself could be deadly, but that was the way they settled on to get the astronauts away from an exploding rocket, which would be even more deadly.
I mean, not that NASA would ever take me, but I read books like this and you hear these trade-offs that happen where it's, okay, we have something that can get you out of the rocket, but it's 1,500 pounds. By the way, the rocket, just using an example, and this does come up in the book, the rocket people are like, they can only get 1,400 pounds.
Right.
At 1,401, rocket don't go.
Right.
And then these choices are made, and very often the safety aspect, I can't keep from going to Challenger ultimately later in the future because there is echoes of that.
Sure.
These questions are made, and I just think these astronauts hearing this stuff and being like, oh, so we're getting rid of the ability to get away from the exploding rocket if it goes off.
Right.
Or the ability that we do have might kill us faster than the rocket.
Exactly, yeah.
Could you have been an astronaut, Jeffrey?
No, I have always said the only way I could go into space would be if you put me under general anesthetic for the liftoff and the landing. Just let me appear on the International Space Station without having to ride a rocket up there, and I would have a good time. And then put me under again for descent and reentry, because I couldn't survive that either. No, Marilyn Lovell, Jim's wife, once said to me, and it was a very sweet thing for her to say, we were on the set of Apollo 13 when we were shooting the liftoff sequence, and it was just, there must have been 800 people there, actors, extras, the director, Ron Howard was there, assistant ADs, costume people. There were all these racks out in this outdoor space of vintage 1970s clothing that the actors were wearing. And Marilyn Lovell surveyed that scene and said to me, I think Jim was born to fly this mission, and I think you were born to tell the story. And I could have kissed her. It was such a sweet thing to say, but she's absolutely right, because Jim has the right stuff, and I have the deeply, profoundly wrong stuff. I am not made for space.
I don't necessarily think it's wrong. It's just different, Jeffrey, and I'm with you.
Yes.
There's a reason why I was in the Army, not the Air Force. I just
right.
I'm good. Put me in a tank on the ground, everything's going to be fine. When you're not doing this stuff and reading about the science of this, it's so easy to take actions for granted. The one you really drove home for me was linking up in space, taking two vessels and that this is the linchpin that unless they figured this out, the moon was impossible to land on.
Right.
Could you just talk a little bit about what are the scientific problems of trying to link up in space two different vessels?
Right. And that it is, as I say in the book, the physics of rendezvous were just nuts. It was just insane what they had to figure out to rendezvous. If let's say two ships are trying to link up and you have an Agena, an unmanned, uncrewed docking vehicle, and 300 feet behind it, just one football field behind it, you have the Gemini that's trying to dock with it. Well, the obvious answer is to accelerate the Gemini slightly and fly up to dock with the Agena. The problem is when you accelerate in orbit, yes, you move closer, but you also climb to a slightly higher orbit. So the act of accelerating would take the Gemini spacecraft above the Agena and it wouldn't be able to dock with it. The alternative, okay, slow the Agena down and let the Gemini catch up with it naturally. But if you slow down a spacecraft, you drop to a lower orbit so the Gemini once again flies over the Agena. The answer involved an incredibly complicated series of engine burns on opposite sides of the planet. So if you want to lower your orbit by 1 nautical mile, you fire your engine on one side of the planet and you have lowered your orbit that desired amount, only when you get to the other side of the planet. You had to negotiate all of these different trade-offs, given the physics of two different vehicles at two different points in space. It took immense computing power, which NASA didn't have back then because no one had immense computing power, but it, sort of pushed the limits of computer technology. And occasionally you had the rare wise man who could do it in his head. And that was Buzz Aldrin. Buzz Aldrin got his PhD at West Point in orbital and rendezvous and docking dynamics. And he was nicknamed Dr. Rendezvous. And what the computers did when the spacecraft was flying, Aldrin was also proving and confirming in his head. So there was a great computer in Buzz Aldrin's head, and there was a great computer in the spacecraft and on the ground.
Buzz is always going to be my favorite as also a West Point graduate.
Yep.
I did appreciate your Army-Navy rivalry that you do recount in space because
yes,
the world cannot hold together how much we disdain losing to the other school.
Yes, exactly. And on Gemini 6 and Gemini 7, which was the first rendezvous in space, two manned spacecraft rendezvousing together right around Christmas in 1965. One ship, there were two Navy men, and another ship, there was one Navy man and one Army man. And in the window of the Gemini 6 spacecraft, which had Wally Schirra and Tom Stafford, both Navy men, Schirra put a sign in his window that said, "Beat Army," just to tease Frank Borman in Gemini 7.
Well, first of all, go Army, beat Navy. And I want to make sure that's in there. Everybody needs to hear
Absolutely.
it. I think about all of the difficult things that we're talking about science-wise, but at the same time, I keep coming back to the fact that the PR aspect of this might have been the hardest thing for everyone. And you kind of mentioned it early on, which is Russia seemed to be very far ahead. And these missions were workman missions. You had to do the little things. You had to make sure they were right. And especially because in the U.S., we have the open press.
Right.
Failure, everyone knew about it. Russia could and did hide it. And the PR stress of, oh, you're just going to go up there for a few hours. The Russians have been up for a few days.
Right.
That could have shut this down faster than anything else if the American people really just said, stop spending our money on this. We're out.
Yeah, and it wasn't until the Gemini program that we pulled ahead. The Russians launched the first satellite, Sputnik, on October 4th, 1957. We didn't manage to get up a satellite until January of 1958. The Russians did it in secret. We did it openly. In December of 1957, just 2.5 months after Sputnik went up, We tried to launch a little Vanguard satellite. It was trying to get to an orbit of roughly 200 nautical miles. It made it less than 200 inches off the pad before it spectacularly exploded on the launch pad. Every headline the next day was some play on Sputnik. They called it Flopnik. They called it Stay Putnik. It was humiliation for the U.S. We finally did get a small satellite up, the Explorer satellite, in 1958, but they beat us to the first satellite. They beat us to the first man in space. Yuri Gagarin went up in April of 62 for a single orbit of the Earth. We didn't get anybody up until May, and that was Al Shepard, who just had a little 15-minute suborbital, which Nikita Khrushchev called a flea hop. They beat us to the first EVA, the first spacewalk. They beat us to the first 2 spacecraft mission. They beat us to the first 2 cosmonaut spacecraft. Everything we did was an act of catching up and essentially eating Russia's dust. It wasn't until the Gemini program that we started figuring things out. We were launching at this incredible breakneck pace of 10 missions in 20 months. And during that entire 20-month period, the Russians who were working on their Soyuz spacecraft did not launch a single mission in that 20-month period. Our missions went essentially unanswered. So it wasn't until the end of Gemini that we were seen as the leaders in space. And then when Apollo happened, we, just sprinted ahead.
It's just very funny. All of these different things, men's lives are at stake. And sure, you can do it, but you have to do it sexy.
Right.
Because the American people got to believe.
They wanted sexy. Absolutely. Yeah, that was the reason the spacesuits the astronauts wore in the Mercury program are basically just fighter jet pressure suits. And fighter jet pressure suits are done in combat green. But for the space program, they made them reflective mylar silver because it was just spacier. That was the way they did it.
Spacier. I love it. You run through all the men. And I mean, we could spend hours just talking about the men that would be willing to do this under these circumstances. I want to just jump to one specific instance because I absolutely love this. We're talking about these extremely disciplined, extremely trained men under amazing pressure. However, we do have a slight mutiny on one of them towards the end. Can you just talk a little bit about maybe why some astronauts might end up a little disgruntled and might tell mission control essentially to shove it?
The Gemini 7 mission was 14 days in space, and they wore lighter spacesuits, which were supposed to be more comfortable. The astronauts nicknamed them get-me-down suits because that was basically all they were good for, liftoff and landing. They weren't functional for anything other than that. Well, the get-me-down suits were unfortunately highly rubberized, and a rubberized suit does not breathe. It's like wearing polyester. You're just going to swelter in it. And Jim Lovell and Frank Borman were sweltering in their get-me-down suits over the course of 14 days. And there was effectively a mutiny when, Jim kept slowly slipping out of his suit. He didn't want to rebel wholly and just take the suit off and fly in his long johns. So he first slipped the suit off his shoulders. Then he took it off his arms. Then he scooched it down to his waist. And finally, he removed it so it was puddling on the floor at his feet. And the flight surgeon noticed that his body temperature, his heart rate, his blood pressure was all much better than Borman's, who was toughing it out wearing the suit. And ultimately, NASA just had to concede that these men had to, as Jim Lovell put it when we first met, fly around the world in their underwear because that was the only way they could deal with these suits.
Because, you detail it, not even the suits. There's a lot of bodily stuff that you have to deal with differently in zero-G, and it sounds like it, I'm trying to think the clinical term, it all sucks. It sounds like it all sucks.
It all sucked. Yeah, they described Gemini 7 as the equivalent of 14 days in a men's room because basically any bodily function you can think of, these two men had to perform in front of one another. I don't know if we want this podcast to go in this direction, but Frank Borman and Jim Lovell both have unfortunately passed, but toward the end of their lives would still tell the story about how you poop in space. It involved plastic bags and antibacterial capsules and portable wipes. It was just awful, just terrible. And you didn't have a shred of privacy when you were doing it. Jim Lovell accepted that as the price of traveling in space. Frank Borman, who was an Army man and a West Point man and an incredibly disciplined person, simply made the decision that for 14 days, he wasn't going to do it. His attitude was, if a man can't control his bowels, he can't control anything. So Borman lasted 3 days, and Borman lasted 5 days, and Borman lasted a week, and Borman lasted 9 days. And finally, on day 9, he turned to Jim and said, Lovell, this is it. And Jim said at this point, he was thinking of self-interest because he had no idea what this was going to be like. And he said, come on, Frank, you've only got 5 days to go here. And Borman said, can't help it, Lovell. So, yeah, I mean, it was, it was glamorous, and then it wasn't glamorous.
I have to say, that is the classiest way to put everything you just talked about. So I don't think we have to put any sort of warning on the episode now because I think you nailed that one.
Okay, that's good. I tried to do that in the book as well.
I always like to ask, because you do get to talk to some of these people that are still around or family members.
Right.
Is there anyone that if I could magically give you an hour with them to talk to, who would it be from the book?
Boy, who would it be from the book? I'll tell you who it would be. It would be Michael Collins. And I want to say Jim Lovell first because Jim was my friend and I was Jim's collaborator on Apollo 13. I had Jim's picture on my bedroom wall when I was a 14-year-old boy and he was flying on Apollo 8. And then flash forward 3 or 4 decades and I was working with him. My 14-year-old head would have spun if you had told me that I was going to reach the point in my life where I would just pick up the phone, dial a number, hear a familiar voice answer and say, hey, Jim, it's Jeff. I would have flipped if you had told me that when I was a little boy. So my loyalties are with Jim Lovell. If you could talk to one man, make it Jim. But if you want a poet of the space program, Michael Collins, his book, Carrying the Fire, was so good, it was practically musical. The man could turn a phrase. The man was brilliant in conveying the experience he had. He did it in writing. He did it in, you could even hear his earth-to-ground transmissions were more lyrical than the other astronauts. Collins was the man to talk to. We unfortunately lost him shortly after the 50th anniversary of Apollo 11. So it was like 2020, I think, Collins died. I had the opportunity to interview him for a piece we did for CBS and was just gratified beyond all telling to talk to Michael Collins.
I want to shift gears a little bit because when you're an author, I've interviewed enough of you to know that you have to go knee deep into research for everything. And it takes over your life to make sure that you're going to get all of this stuff right. Do you ever get chance to read books for fun, especially, nonfiction or history books for fun and just kind of put everything else aside when you're researching? Or if you don't, do you have any friends who are authors with books coming out and you want to plug them on the podcast now?
It's funny you should say that. I have written 13 books. I'm working on my 14th. I once said I could write a short book faster than I could read a long one. I'm not as well read as I would like to be. For me, reading is a bit of a busman's holiday. It's a bit of taking my work and taking it into my relaxation. So, I certainly have read a million books and I've, got a large library that I've read on my iPad. But as for, being a truly accomplished reader, I think I will leave that to other authors. If I was going to plug somebody I know, someone I used to work with, there's a fellow named Carl Zimmer. I used to work with at Discover magazine. He has worked for the New York Times since. And Carl might be one of the best science writers I know. He writes about natural sciences. He writes about evolution. He wrote an entire book called Parasite Rex about parasites. He had a wonderful book called Her Mother's Laugh about evolution and about inherited traits. So Carl is somebody I would strongly recommend. Someone who used to work at Discover magazine, Jim Gorman, used to write the Light Elements humor column. Later, a dear friend of mine and a wonderful writer named Judith Stone inherited the Light Elements column. And in the early 90s, I inherited Light Elements from Judy. Jim Gorman is a funny and smart and sharp writer and covers science in a really lovely and humorous and digestible way. So Gorman is someone else I would recommend.
Perfect. They're all going on my list.
Okay.
Final question for you. It's what I always end up with is there are people who, might look at your book and say, oh, well, space, I don't know anything about that. Nonfiction's boring. That's a science class I learned in high school. You and I both know they're missing out. They're just misguided.
Right.
If one of those people sat down in front of you and said, Jeffrey, why should I read this book? What would you say?
Because I think the space program, yes, it always has been about physics. It always has been about engineering. It always has been about orbital dynamics. But it's about uplift as well. It's about being carried outside of yourself. It's about the communal experience of sending emissaries of our species into space and onto other worlds. When Apollo 11 went up, I was 15 years old. I was following every mission closely. And as the schedule started to shape up, I was crestfallen because it was appearing more and more that the first landing on the moon would happen in the summer. And of course it did. On July 20th, 1969, we had the Apollo 11 landing. Well, months before, I had already begun to fret because my practice during an Apollo mission was to plant myself in front of our Magnavox color TV in the den of our suburban home and watch every nanosecond of that mission from liftoff to splashdown. I was going to be at summer camp. I wasn't going to be able to do that. And I was thinking, I'm going to miss the landing. And even if I do, it's just going to be on a black and white TV in a rec hall with 200 other people around me making noise. And this is not the way I want to see this epical experience. Well, as it turned out, that was exactly the way I wanted to experience that epical event. I didn't realize until it happened that this was meant to be something shared. This was meant to be something communal. This is meant to be something that's experienced not alone, but in a group, because that was, writ small, a symbol of the larger dynamic that was going on, that there were 3.5 billion humans in the world at that point. And three out of 3.5 billion, 1 billionth of the human race was at the moon, and 2 of those 3 men were on the moon. This was something that we were doing communally, and this was something that needed to be touched and shared and experienced communally. So if there's anything I can convey in my book that I think is of the most value, it's that we're a fractious species, we can be a violent species, we're an unforgivably xenophobic species, which leads to, immigration, crackdowns, and all manner of bad behavior. But we are a dreamy species. We're a species that dares great things. And if Gemini, if my Apollo 13 book, if my Apollo 8 book does anything at all, I wanted to convey that idea of collective excellence, sending our emissaries of our species aloft and experiencing it together.
Well, Jeffrey, it's fantastic. I'm going to tell everybody to read it before Ron Howard comes calling you again, because I bet he will.
Okay.
Thank you so much for coming on and talk about it.
Thank you so much for having me.
And that's it for this episode. Jeffrey, thank you so much. Gemini, go out and get it, folks. It's a great read. It's super easy, super fast. You're going to have an awesome time. In the meantime, hit us up Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Don't forget the YouTube channel. Until next time, nerds, stay cool.
History